It was meant to smash Ukraine. The grand summer offensive would be the final nail in the coffin, and it would be Vladimir Putin hammering that nail into place. Ukraine wouldn't collapse, sure, but it would lose so much ground that Putin would hold all of the cards in peace negotiations. That's what Russia's delusional leader thought his soldiers would achieve during the summer. They failed. Putin's summer offensive collapsed around him, and according to recent reports, Russia has experienced 210,000 casualties for nothing. On September 12, the Kyiv Post published a video on YouTube featuring an in-depth analysis of Russia's summer offensive provided by Chuck Farah, a former US Navy SEAL and now a Kyiv Post correspondent. Farah outlined what Putin's plans were for the summer, noting that Russia was going to push on multiple fronts to force Ukraine's defenders to capitulate. The BBC explained more in a July article, noting that the bulk of Russia's offensive seemed to be focused on the key regions of Sumy, Pokrovsk and Kharkiv. In Pokrovsk, the BBC said Russia targeted the city to disrupt Ukrainian supply lines and push deeper into Donetsk, while seeking a buffer zone primarily along the Kharkiv and Sumy border to prevent a recurrence of Ukraine's daring August 2024 incursion into the Russian oblast of Kursk. The goal for Kharkiv was less clear, with Putin presumably wanting to capture a city, or at least a territory near the city, that he's tried to take since he launched his invasion. And in Pokrovsk, the strategic goal was simple: disrupt logistics and press Donetsk advances. Now, beyond these three regions, Russia also aimed to push deeper into Kherson, finally take Chasiv Yar, capture Lyman and Kupiansk, and force the collapse of Ukraine's defense in Zaporizhzhia. These were lofty goals, and Russia failed to achieve any of them on a meaningful level. In each sector, Russian forces have encountered fierce resistance, achieving only marginal gains while suffering staggering losses, Farah points out. He then breaks down what Russia achieved, or more accurately, failed to achieve, during a summer that was supposed to win the war for Putin. First, in Kherson. Russia's goal here, Farah notes, was to consolidate the control it already had over occupied territories in the region while pushing Ukraine's forces back across the Dnipro River. Russia committed big to this goal. It redeployed its 810th Naval Infantry Brigade to Kherson, in addition to sending a parachute regiment and several other units. However, Russia's big problem was that the Dnipro River ended up proving too much of a problem. Far from pushing Ukraine back across it, Russia found out just how hard it was to cross that river itself. In July, Forbes reported that Ukraine's 30th Marine Corps, which is assigned to preventing Russia from crossing the Dnipro River, said that Russia was launching daily assaults on the small islands in the river by June. Those assaults, focused on the river's west bank and relying on a combination of drones and electronic warfare, failed. Ukraine maintained fire control over the area, leaving Russia with no ability to move any significant numbers of troops to the areas where those soldiers needed to be in if they wanted to push Ukraine back. Ukrainian forces have steadfastly maintained positions on the south bank, Farah also reports. There they repel Russia's assaults, inflicting heavy losses on Putin's forces with every failed attempt to advance. What did Russia end up achieving in Kherson? No significant territorial gains were reported, and Russian operations were hampered by Ukrainian drone strikes targeting supply lines, Farah says. That would have been bad enough, but Russia's failure to take any meaningful territory in Kherson was punctuated by Ukraine dropping the hammer on its soldiers, specifically the French-made AASM Hammer, which is a guided munition that Ukraine is now capable of firing from most of its fighter jets, including many of its Soviet-era aerial platforms. Ukraine highlighted the devastating force of the AASM Hammer just before Putin's summer offensive started. On April 23, United 24 media reported that Ukraine used one of its MiG-29s to level a Russian headquarters in Kherson using an AASM Hammer, taking out a two-story building where Russian troops had gathered in the process. Farah reveals other highlights of Ukraine's hammer dropping, stating that Ukrainian Air Force used the summer to take out Russian troop concentrations, command nodes, and drone control points throughout the region. Russia also didn't have an answer for Ukraine's partisans. These are people, often civilians, who have formed their own irregular military forces that are loosely linked to a country's main military, who fight for their country somewhat unofficially. In Kherson, partisans played a huge role in defense. In February 2023, NPR reported on the region's underground resistance, showing how ragtag yet effective these groups can be. It told the story of a 59-year-old accountant and city council member named Oksana Pahomy, who helped to evacuate families from the region after being refused entry into Kherson's territorial army. These are the types of people Putin's forces would never expect to encounter, and they're just as important to Kherson's defense as Ukraine's official military. Partisans are playing on Russian supply trains and logistics, Farah reports. They've also targeted Russian sentries and collaborators within the occupational security forces. So, as Ukraine soldiers fight hard in Kherson, Russia's troops are being weakened by civilian fighters who sabotage and disrupt every supporting service those Russian troops need to sustain their offensives. The result for Putin is simple: close to nothing gained in Kherson and no consolidation of the territory Russia already holds. Next up is Zaporizhzhia, the home of an infamous nuclear power plant that Russian forces have occupied for most of the war. The Zaporizhzhia Oblast ended up being another site of summer failure for Putin's forces. Russia's goal here was to launch numerous offensives with the goal of advancing toward the region's main city, which shares the Zaporizhzhia name. But predictable Russian small-scale attacks, usually involving platoon-sized units and conducted in broad daylight, were repelled with heavy casualties, Farah says. These types of small-scale attacks have become a feature of Russia's assaults during the summer. They were highlighted in a July Politico report that highlighted how Russia has switched from massive mechanized assaults to using smaller units to attempt to infiltrate into Ukraine's positions. This change in Russia's tactics caused problems at first. Ukraine's fortifications were geared toward defending against the large assaults Russia has relied on for most of its invasion. But Ukraine did what it's been doing for 3.5 years: adapt and overcome. While Russia's use of smaller units does allow its soldiers to gain some forward momentum without being detected as easily by Ukraine's drones, the approach comes with a fatal flaw. If these smaller units manage to break through Ukraine's defenses, they can't sustain the breakthrough. Their limited numbers mean whatever gaps they create are narrow, and the units that get through can't bed in and fortify. Ukraine identified this problem in Zaporizhzhia and took full advantage, as Farah explains. In this area of operations, Ukraine mastered the tactic of allowing Russian units to penetrate as far as 3 to 5 kilometers before they attacked. Ukrainian artillery, drones and infantry then smashed the lead Russian elements and annihilated the survivors as they attempted to regain Russian lines, he says. In other words, Ukraine baited Russia's smaller units into making what they thought were considerable gains, only to close the gaps the Russians created, encircle them, and then take them out. It's a technique that's going to reappear several times during this video, and it's one that Ukraine now knows is a great defense against Russia's smaller units. Using this technique, Ukraine inflicted severe damage on Russia's troops in Zaporizhzhia. And nowhere is that more apparent than in Hulaya Pole, where Russia has grown so desperate that it's sending cooks to the front lines because it has nobody else to send. Find out what's happening in the Zaporizhzhia city and what it means for Russia in our video covering the cook debacle. The next region of Russian failure is a big one: Pokrovsk. Referred to as the gateway to Donetsk by many in Russia, Pokrovsk is a city that Putin really needs to capture. The gateway label is right on the money, as Pokrovsk is within touching distance of the Donetsk administrative border. Reaching that border means that Putin could realistically claim to control Donetsk, which would be huge in his attempt to convince the rest of the world that Ukraine should cede the Donbas to Russia if it wants peace. Pokrovsk is also a logistical hub, supplying a major share of Ukraine's troops in Donetsk, making it one of Ukraine's most vital fortress cities. Putin really wanted to take Pokrovsk this summer. He wanted it so badly that he committed a staggering 110,000 soldiers to the region and had them immediately start capturing as much territory around Pokrovsk as possible. Russia's strategy made sense. By capturing settlements outside Pokrovsk, Russia would come close to encircling the city, allowing it to attack from multiple angles. Eventually, Ukraine's defense would break, and Russia would take Pokrovsk. But like every other well-laid Russian plan during the summer, the offensive in Pokrovsk failed. Farah calls the city Russia's primary objective during the summer, noting that many experts, both in Russia and the West, thought that Russia would mount an irresistible breakthrough. But few of them bothered to report that this Russian breakthrough was directed away from the city rather than toward it, Farah says. Russia kept trying to push north instead of heading south. Russia used its smaller units approach in Pokrovsk as well, and Ukraine eventually figured out that allowing Russia to make the mistake of attacking in the wrong direction worked in its favor. Ukraine countered when it needed to, retaking territory around Pokrovsk that would have enabled the multiple angles assault approach mentioned earlier. Russia took some territory, though that was more due to Ukraine willingly ceding that territory, Farah explained. Everywhere that really mattered saw Ukraine fight back, bogging Russia's soldiers down in repeated assaults and counter-assaults that saw Russia's gains limited to a handful of small villages and settlements, but not Pokrovsk itself. Pokrovsk remains in Ukraine's hands. The encirclement Putin thought would allow him to claim the city hasn't materialized, meaning the big summer objective wasn't achieved. Pokrovsk has transformed into a death trap for Russia's soldiers, as explained in our video covering what Ukraine managed to achieve during the summer. Viktor Trehubov, who is the spokesman for the Dnipro Operational Strategic Group of troops, sums up Russia's failure nicely when talking about the 110,000 soldiers Putin dedicated to Pokrovsk during the summer. To put this figure into perspective, most European countries don't even have an army of this size. The summer campaign is coming to an end. Despite very aggressive actions, and despite managing to push through Ukrainian positions in some areas, Russia hasn't achieved any quick victory. RBC Ukraine reports Trehubov is saying. Chasiv Yar was another target for Russia during the summer. Another of Ukraine's fortress settlements in Donetsk, Chasiv Yar has been a target for years. Control is disputed as of August-September 2025, with Russia claiming to hold all of the city and Ukraine disputing that claim. Putin's forces failed to cross a key waterway that would allow them to take the city. The Seversky Donets Canal stood in their way, and despite launching several mechanized assaults, Russia simply failed to cross it. RBC Ukraine reported in late August that Putin has tried to claim Russian control over Chasiv Yar, but he's lying. That control would have enabled an assault on Konstantinovka, which is why Russia wants Chasiv Yar in the first place. The fact that this assault hasn't happened yet reveals everything that needs to be known to know about Russia's true status in Chasiv Yar. There isn't much more to say about this aspect of the summer offensive. Russia tried and failed to take another important settlement. Next up, there's Lyman. Located in the Donetsk Oblast, Lyman is the one holdout settlement in a region that Russia claims to have full control over. It doesn't, but it's not far off. The fall of Lyman was supposed to leave no doubt about Russia's claim, but as UA Wire reports, Russia's summer offensive in that direction failed as well. Intense attacks throughout June failed to breach Ukraine's defenses, the outlet notes. At one point between June 10 and June 14, Russia launched 200 assault operations in a single day, and later reinforced by rallying units of the 144th Motor Rifle Division. None of it worked. Russia carrying out 200 assaults in a single day hints at the fact that it was using smaller units in Lyman, just as it did around Pokrovsk and in Zaporizhzhia. Ukraine countered in the parts of Lyman that really mattered, preventing Russia from making any real progress. Some territory was ceded, though it was again territory that serves no purpose to Russia. Again, Ukraine was willing to cede militarily irrelevant terrain, Farah says, which forced Russia to spill blood and lose equipment for progress in the wrong direction that ultimately led Putin's forces nowhere. Russia's offensive in Kupiansk didn't fare any better. The city, which is in the Kyiv Oblast, was subjected to a Russian attempt at encirclement, much like Pokrovsk. Russia had actually made some progress in the region prior to the summer, taking 500 square kilometers at a horrific cost of soldiers and equipment, Farah says. But the encirclement that was meant to lead to the taking of Kupiansk failed so badly that it resulted in one of Ukraine's bloodiest victories of the war so far. In a recent engagement, 2 entire Russian battalions were annihilated in a Ukrainian HIMARS strike, described by Russian Telegram channels as one of the bloodiest and most massive strikes in the entire war, Farah says. That strike cost Russia a lot more than 2 battalions. It showed how ineffective Putin's attritional strategy has become, as well as highlighting Russia's inability to use battalions effectively to assault Ukraine's defenses. Now guess what's coming next? Kupiansk is still in Ukraine's hands. Russia even attempted a similar strategy to the one seen in Pokrovsk, where it infiltrated the city with a small number of troops, only for those soldiers to be annihilated. Center for Defense Strategies expert Viktor Kevliuk explains what happened next. As for the pipeline story in Kupiansk, I can't say much. I only know that the occupiers recently tried a similar tactic in Pokrovsk, Kevliuk noted on September 13. Yesterday, I spoke with a battalion commander defending on the Kupiansk axis. He said 13 enemy troops infiltrated their rear, 2 were captured, 6 were eliminated, and the rest are being hunted down in basements where they hide. Russia's troops can hide all they want. Ukraine will find them and remind them that their efforts to take Kupiansk have yet to meaningfully succeed. And finally, there's Sumy. Recall Putin's goal for this oblast from earlier in the video. He wants to create a buffer zone in Sumy to ensure that nothing like the cursed counter-invasion can happen again. At the risk of sounding predictable here, Russia's Sumy offensive failed just as badly as everything else during the summer. Ukrainian forces were able to break contact and maneuver to more defensible positions, leaving Russian units exhausted, overstretched, and unable to press home cross-border attacks, Farah points out. And now, Ukraine is starting to reverse the small gains that Russia did manage to make in Sumy. On September 14, Reuters reported that Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has claimed that Ukraine has managed to advance into border districts in northern Sumy, where Russia's soldiers spent the entire summer trying to gain the foothold they needed for Putin's buffer zone. These are good results in border areas of Sumy region, Zelensky said. Those results are coming just a few months after Oleksandr Syrsky, who is the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, declared that Ukraine had successfully stalled Russia's advance into Sumy. So, like every other region covered in this video, the story stays the same. Russia barely gained anything important. It sacrificed thousands of troops for a whole lot of nothing. And that leads to the numbers. On August 31, United 24 Media laid out Russia's losses for 2025 so far. It reported that the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces says that Russia has lost 210,000 soldiers who were killed or injured since the beginning of 2025. That amounts to about 26,250 soldiers per month, meaning Russia will end 2025 having lost 315,000 soldiers if it continues in the same vein as seen during the summer. Russia's material losses have been just as bad in 2025. More than 2,100 of its armoured vehicles have been destroyed, along with over 7,300 of the artillery systems Russia needs to sustain its shelling. 157 Russian multiple-launch rocket systems have been consigned to the dustbin of the Ukraine war, and another 1,200 of its tanks are now in ruins thanks to Ukraine's brave summer defence. Most of these losses were experienced during the summer offensive, and they're massive. So, what did Russia get in return for all of this blood spilled and metal shattered? Allow Farah to explain. This summer, Russia has gained just 1/3 of 1% of Ukraine's total land mass, he says in his Kyiv Post piece. Again, without a single strategic or even tactical accomplishment to show for the destruction of the functional equivalent of more than 26 divisions. These types of losses in return for so little territory are unsustainable to the point where Farah says that no nation in the history of the world has ever managed to achieve its war aims under these conditions. Every day, Russia is losing the equivalent of 2 battalions of infantry, Farah says. Its logistical network, at least on the front lines, has become such a joke that it's relying on civilian cars and in some cases even donkeys to transport supplies to troops. The Moscow Times reported on Russia's donkey dilemma back in March, stating then that it underscored a staggering equipment shortage for Russia. After the failed summer offensive, those shortages have only gotten worse, meaning Russia is going to be reduced to hee-hawing more of its equipment across the front lines in the coming months. Russian morale is shot, corruption is still endemic, and it's only feeding into the many problems that led to the failure of the summer offensive. Putin's summer offensive has collapsed into a costly debacle, Farah concludes. Russia's territorial gains since May are paltry in return for the loss of over 210,000 troops and thousands of pieces of armor and equipment. This summer exposed systemic weaknesses in Russia's military, and there isn't a whole lot that Putin can do about those weaknesses. Now, as Putin tries to absorb the utter failure of a summer campaign that he thought would win the war for Russia, he's also dealing with problems at home. What is Russia going to do about the flood of embittered, violent and angry soldiers that will be coming back home after the Ukraine war ends? The Kremlin is in crisis, as Putin's own soldiers could be his next major problem. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more videos covering Russia's failures in its invasion of Ukraine.